selling vapes. To kids.
Don't shout at her.
Well, Mitchell's older than I am.
Is that the point?
I said don't shout.
Why don't we all just take 5 minutes?
Who's chatting to you?
This is his house. You just barged in.
Look, do you want everyone round here thinking she's been raised by scum?
Scum. Did you just call my mum scum?
Oh, that's enough, Ravi.
Your dad's right.
And who asked you go trim your bum flap?
Avani?
Avani? What if they get the police involved?
Well, then you can go and shout at the police then, innit?
This ain't a joke, Avani.
Okay, well, my mum doesn't have a problem with it, so leave me alone.
Avani!
Go away!
We wouldn't have this problem if you raised her properly.
You just shout at her, she shouts back. She ain't gonna listen to you.
Look, I ain't taking parenting lessons from you, yeah?
Yeah, all right. Do you know what? £10 a vape.
Buy us our own crib next year.
No.
Don't.
Your dad's probably right. Boring, overpumped, but right.
You're meant to be on my side.
You're 14.
Yeah, 14-year-old millionaire.
And you don't want a bit of juvie cramping your style.
Mum, no one goes to juvie for selling vapes. But I'm the one who got them.
OK, so we'll think of another moneymaker, yeah?
Fine.
Hand 'em over.
Look, if this is like some stop and search or something, yeah, you're already too late because I've given them to Mum.
Just like that.
Yep. And she didn't even have to bribe me with McClunkies.
Wasn't trying to bribe you.
She's brought me up on her own, you know. I mean, you had your fake dad helping with Nugget.
I know.
And she didn't have no 2-year holiday either, feet up inside. Okay. If you want to talk about all the things that are wrong with her, you can pull up a chair, because I've got a long list of things. But being a mum, that ain't one of them.
Yeah. Maybe she's done all right.
She's down at Peggy's. Vodka tonic, 2 cubes of ice.
Two ice cubes. Yeah.
Better be a double,
You have raised a remarkable girl.
even if she sells vapes.
Yeah, well, she ain't the first step outside the law, is she? She's a good kid. You should be proud of her.
I'm all right, ain't I? For scum.
You know, when I knew you, you were chaos.
And you were a drug-pushing fuck in 2 small shirts. People change. Thought you liked the chaos. All that wild energy.
Yeah, there's plus sides. It's frequent, quite lengthy plus sides.
I think you're confusing yourself with someone with stamina.
Bits fiddle me, babe.
Oh.
You don't mind if I join you?
Sorry. I've got a date.